Right now, as you are watching this, something is breaking that no one thought could ever break. Not a trade deal, not a speech, not a temporary political fight. Something much bigger. The trust that held NATO together for over 75 years is starting to crack, and it is happening faster than anyone expected. Just days ago, Donald Trump used one word to describe America's closest allies. Not in private, not behind closed doors, but out in the open, for the entire world to hear. Cowards. And what happened next is something that has never happened before in modern history. 8 allies, countries that built their entire security around America, started preparing for a future without it. No warning, no dramatic announcement, just quiet, calculated moves that are now sending shockwaves through every capital in the Western world. And at the center of this storm is a question that would have been unthinkable just 1 year ago. Is America still a reliable protector, or has the world already started moving on? Now, before you understand why this moment is so dangerous, you need to understand what is actually at stake here. Because this is not just about words. It is not just about politics. This is about the foundation of NATO itself. Since 1949, NATO has operated on a single promise, one idea that made everything else possible. If one country is attacked, all of them respond. Article 5. Simple, clear, absolute. And behind that promise, there was always one reality that no one questioned. The United States would be there. Not maybe, not sometimes, always. That belief shaped everything. Countries across Europe made a choice. They chose not to build their own nuclear weapons. They chose not to create independent deterrence. They chose to trust America with their survival. And that trust was not free. It came with a cost, a very real cost. When the September 11th attacks happened, NATO invoked Article 5 for the first and only time in its history, and the response was immediate. Allies did not hesitate, they did not debate, they showed up. Soldiers from Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Poland, Denmark, and many others deployed to Afghanistan. They fought in a war that was not started on their soil, for a country that asked for their help. Over 3,500 Allied troops lost their lives. Think about that number, 3,500. That was the price of loyalty. That was the cost of believing in a system where America would stand by them in return. And now, decades later, that same system is under pressure in a way no one predicted. Because when Donald Trump called those allies cowards, it did not just sound like an insult. It sounded like something much more dangerous. It sounded like a signal that the guarantee they had relied on for generations might not be as solid as they thought. And when that kind of doubt enters an alliance like NATO, everything starts to change. Here is what most people are missing. Alliances do not collapse overnight. They do not end with a single announcement. They weaken quietly, step by step, decision by decision. And that is exactly what is happening right now. Across Europe, leaders are no longer asking the question they asked for decades. How strong is America's commitment? They are asking something new. What happens if that commitment disappears? And once that question is asked, it cannot be unasked. Because the truth is, the world has seen moments like this before, moments where one shift, one statement, one decision starts a chain reaction that no one can stop. And what makes this moment different is the speed. Usually changes like this take years, negotiations, agreements, debates. But this time, it is happening in real time. Governments are moving quietly. Militaries are adjusting plans. Conversations that were once unthinkable are now happening behind closed doors. And one country in particular is watching all of this very closely. A country that shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States. A country that has trusted America not just as an ally, but as a partner in almost every major conflict of the modern era. Canada. Because for Canada, this is not just a distant European issue. This is personal, this is immediate. And this is where the story begins to take a turn that no one saw coming. Because while Europe is quietly preparing for a future without depending entirely on the United States, Canada is being forced to confront a question it has avoided for decades. What happens if the shield you trusted is no longer guaranteed? And what Canada decides next could change everything. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that most people still do not fully understand. Because while the headlines focused on one word, cowards, what happened behind the scenes was far more serious. Governments did not respond with anger. They did not rush to cameras. They did something much more dangerous. They started planning quietly, carefully, and in some cases, urgently. The first signs came from Europe's most powerful capitals. Conversations that used to be theoretical suddenly became real. Defense ministers, military planners, intelligence officials, they all began asking the same question at the same time. If the United States steps back, even slightly, who fills that gap? And more importantly, how fast can that gap be filled? Because in global security, time is everything. You do not get years to react, you get weeks, sometimes days. And that is when all eyes turn to one country, not the United States, not the United Kingdom, but France. Because France holds something no other European Union country has, an independent nuclear arsenal, not shared. not dependent, fully controlled. For decades, that arsenal was seen as national protection, a shield for France alone. But now, for the first time in modern history, that idea is starting to change. Quietly at first, then all at once. At the center of this shift is Emmanuel Macron. And what he is proposing is something that would have sounded impossible just a few years ago. A European nuclear umbrella, not led by Washington, not controlled by NATO alone, but anchored in Paris. Think about that for a moment. For over 75 years, the nuclear backbone of Western security has been American. Now, for the first time, another option is being seriously considered. And here is why that matters. Because nuclear deterrence is not just about weapons, it is about trust, absolute trust. The belief that if the worst moment comes, the country holding that power will act without hesitation, without conditions. That is what allies believed about the United States. That belief is what kept the system stable. But once doubt enters that equation, everything shifts. Germany was among the first to respond. A country that has hosted American nuclear weapons for decades suddenly began exploring new possibilities. Not publicly at first, but the signals were clear. Discussions about participating in French nuclear strategy, talks about joint exercises, even conversations about whether German aircraft could one day carry non-American nuclear weapons. That is not a small adjustment. That is a structural shift. And Germany was not alone. Poland, sitting on the front line of tension with Russia, moved quickly. Their leadership made it clear. They are not waiting for reassurance. They are preparing for reality. The Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, each one stepping closer to a framework that does not rely entirely on Washington. No dramatic speeches, no official break, just a quiet realignment happening in plain sight. And then comes the detail that changes everything. These are not just political conversations. These are military preparations, real deployments, real coordination, real planning for a future where Europe can stand on its own if it has to. Now stop for a second and think about the scale of this. 8 countries, 8 long-standing allies, all moving in the same direction at the same time. That does not happen by accident. That does not happen because of one bad day or one controversial statement. That happens when a deeper shift is already underway. And this is where it becomes impossible to ignore the connection, because every single one of these decisions started accelerating after one moment, after one message that made allies question something they had never questioned before. Not America's power, but America's reliability, because power is not enough. It never has been. In alliances, reliability is everything. And once partners begin to doubt that reliability, they do not wait for confirmation, they act. Now bring this back to Canada, because Canada is not watching this from a distance anymore. Canada is part of this equation. A country that has always operated under one assumption, that its security is deeply tied to the United States, is now facing a reality where that assumption is being tested. Not in theory, in real time. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Canada does not have nuclear weapons. It never chose to build them. It never needed to. Because the understanding was simple. The United States would be there. That was the shield. That was the guarantee. But what happens when that guarantee starts to feel uncertain? What happens when your closest ally is no longer predictable? That is the question Canadian leaders are now being forced to confront. And the answer is not simple. Because any move away from complete dependence on the United States changes everything. Politically, militarily, strategically, and yet doing nothing may be even riskier. Because as Europe moves, as France steps forward, as new structures begin to form, Canada is standing at a crossroads. One path keeps everything the same. Trust the system, trust the past, trust that nothing fundamental has changed. The other path asks a much harder question: what if it has? And once that question is on the table, it does not go away. And now the story reaches a point where it stops being theoretical and starts becoming real. Because while Europe is moving pieces into place, while strategies are being rewritten and alliances quietly reshaped, something happened that pulled this entire situation out of the shadows and into the open. A single question, direct, unavoidable, and aimed straight at Mark Carney. It did not come from a rival government. It did not come from a military official. It came from a journalist. But the weight of that question carried something much bigger. The question was simple. If the United States were to take action against Greenland, would Canada respond? Think about that for a moment. A NATO country being asked whether it would defend territory linked to another ally autochthon against the United States itself. Just a year ago, that question would have sounded absurd, impossible, even offensive. Today, it is being asked on record, and the answer mattered. Mark Carney did not panic. He did not dismiss it. He chose his words carefully, measured, controlled. He said Canada stands firmly behind the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. No direct confrontation, no escalation, but also no unconditional alignment. It was the kind of answer that signals something without saying it outright, because in diplomacy, what you do not say is often more important than what you do. And that answer sent a message, not just to Washington, but to every ally watching this unfold. Canada is thinking. Canada is evaluating. Canada is not taking anything for granted anymore. Now, here's where things become even more serious, because this is not happening in isolation. This question about Greenland connects directly to a broader tension that has been building quietly. Denmark, a longtime NATO ally, has already been pushed into an uncomfortable position. Public remarks, strategic pressure, even discussions about control over Greenland have created a situation where trust is no longer automatic. And when trust begins to fracture between allies, the consequences are never contained. They spread. Because every country watching this is now asking the same thing. If it can happen to Denmark, if it can happen to Europe, it can happen to anyone. And that includes Canada. Now step back and look at the bigger picture forming right in front of you. On one side, you have the United States, still the most powerful military force in the world, still the backbone of NATO, still holding unmatched global influence. That has not changed, but power alone is no longer the only factor. Perception matters, trust matters, consistency matters. On the other side, you have a growing shift. France stepping into a new role, European nations coordinating more closely, independent strategies being developed, not to replace NATO, but to prepare for a future where reliance on a single country might not be enough. And right in the middle of that shift is Canada. Because Canada's position is unique. It is not just another ally. It is directly connected to the United States in ways no European country is. Geography, trade, defense, everything is intertwined, which makes any shift infinitely more complicated. Canada cannot simply walk away. But it also cannot ignore what is happening, and that is why the conversation inside Canada is changing faster than most people realize. Not in dramatic speeches, not in public declarations, but in analysis, in policy discussions. In quiet questions being asked behind closed doors, should Canada diversify its security partnerships? Should it engage more deeply with European defense frameworks? Should it rely less on a system that suddenly feels less certain? These are not fringe ideas anymore. These are real conversations happening right now. And here is the part that makes this moment so critical, because once a country like Canada starts asking these questions, it signals something much bigger than a single policy shift. It signals a change in mindset, a shift from assumption to uncertainty. And uncertainty in global security changes everything, because alliances are not just built on treaties, they are built on belief. The belief that when the moment comes, everyone will stand together. But what happens when that belief starts to fade? What happens when countries begin preparing not for cooperation, but for the possibility of standing alone? That is the direction this story is moving in. And the next developments will determine whether this is just a temporary shock or the beginning of a permanent realignment that reshapes the balance of power for decades to come. And now we reach the moment where everything becomes impossible to ignore. Because up until now, you could still argue that this is just talk, just tension, just political noise that will eventually fade. But what is happening next is not talk, it is action. Physical, measurable, undeniable action that is already changing the structure of global security in real time. It begins again with France, because what France is building is not a concept anymore. It is becoming a system, a real operational framework designed to do one thing: extend nuclear protection beyond its own borders. And this is where the shift becomes historic. For decades, nuclear deterrence inside NATO was centered on the United States, American warheads, American delivery systems, American command. That was the core. Now, for the first time, another country is stepping into that role in a meaningful way. French nuclear-capable aircraft are being prepared for broader coordination. Military exercises are being expanded. Strategic planning is being shared with allies in ways that go far beyond symbolic cooperation. This is not about replacing NATO overnight. It is about creating a parallel capability, one that can function even if American support becomes uncertain. And once that kind of structure begins to take shape, it creates momentum, because no country wants to be the last to adapt. Germany continues to move closer. Poland is accelerating its defense posture. Smaller nations that once relied completely on the existing system are now looking for additional layers of protection. Not because they want to break away, but because they feel they have to be ready for anything. And then comes the moment that truly defines how serious this situation has become. Denmark. A country that has stood beside the United States for decades, a country that paid a real price in past conflicts, a country that never questioned its place inside the alliance. And now that same country is taking steps that would have been unthinkable in any other era. Infrastructure is being reconsidered. Military access is no longer assumed. Strategic assets are being evaluated not just for defense, but for control. Control over who can use them. Control over how they are used. Control over whether they can be used at all. This is not symbolic resistance. This is preparation. Preparation for a scenario that until recently did not exist in serious planning. The possibility of needing to limit American military operations on Allied territory. Let that sink in, because when allies start planning how to restrict each other, you are no longer looking at a stable alliance. You are looking at a system under stress. Now connect all of this back to Canada. Because while these changes are happening across the Atlantic, Canada is watching something very specific, not just the rise of a European alternative, not just the tension inside NATO, but the speed at which all of this is unfolding. And speed changes the calculation, because slow changes can be managed, they can be debated, they can be delayed. But fast changes force decisions, and Canada is now facing a timeline it did not expect. Should it deepen coordination with Europe? Should it stay fully aligned with the United States and trust that this moment will pass? Or should it begin preparing for a future where it needs more options than it has today? These are not easy questions, because every option carries risk. Moving closer to Europe could strain its relationship with Washington. Doing nothing could leave it exposed if the system continues to shift. Trying to balance both could create uncertainty on all sides, and yet doing nothing at all may be the biggest risk of all. Because what is becoming clear now is that this is not a temporary disruption. This is not a single political moment that will simply fade away with time. Too many decisions have already been made. Too many plans are already in motion. France is expanding its role. European allies are adjusting their strategies. Denmark is redefining control over its territory, and Canada is being pulled into a conversation it never expected to have, all at once. And here is the reality that no leader can ignore anymore. Once military structures begin to change, once deployments are planned, once cooperation frameworks are built, they do not simply disappear, even if tensions ease. Even if leadership changes, even if rhetoric softens, the system has already started evolving, and the deeper it evolves, the harder it becomes to go back, which means what we are witnessing right now is not just a reaction, it is the beginning of something new. Something that could redefine how alliances work, how trust is measured, and how countries protect themselves in a world where certainty is no longer guaranteed. And the final piece of this story is what happens next. And now we arrive at the point where there is no going back, because everything you have just heard, every statement, every decision, every quiet move behind the scenes has already crossed a line that alliances rarely recover from. Not because they collapse overnight, but because something far more important has been shaken. Certainty. For over 7 decades, the Western world operated on a simple assumption: the system would hold, no matter the tension, no matter the disagreement. When it mattered most, the alliance would stand together. That belief was never written into a single document, but it was understood by every leader, every military planner, every nation that placed its security in that system. And now that belief is no longer absolute. Because when Donald Trump used that one word, cowards, it did more than spark outrage. It forced a question that cannot be undone. What if the guarantee is no longer guaranteed? And once that question exists, everything begins to shift around it. Look at what already cannot be reversed. France has stepped forward and begun expanding its nuclear role in a way it has not done in decades, not as a symbol, but as a strategy, a real operational framework that other nations are now aligning with. Multiple European allies have moved closer to that framework, not in theory, but in planning, coordination, and preparation, quietly building options that did not exist before. Denmark is reassessing control over its own strategic territory in ways that signal a level of caution toward an ally that would have been unthinkable just a short time ago. And Canada, a country that has always stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States, is now openly part of a conversation about sovereignty, alignment, and future security choices. These are not temporary reactions. These are structural changes. Because once a country starts building alternative options for its own survival, it does not simply abandon them later. Even if tensions cool, even if leadership changes, even if relationships improve, the backup plan becomes part of the system. And when enough countries adopt that mindset, the entire system changes. That is what you are witnessing right now. Not the end of NATO, not a sudden collapse, but a transformation, a shift from a single dominant security structure to a more fragmented, more cautious, more uncertain network of alliances. And in that kind of world, power is no longer just about strength, it is about trust. Because a nuclear shield is not just metal and machinery, it is a promise. A promise that in the worst possible moment, one nation will risk everything for another. For decades, that promise pointed in one direction. Now, for the first time in a generation, it is starting to split. Some nations are still looking to Washington. Others are beginning to look toward Paris. And countries like Canada are standing in between, trying to decide which future is the safer one. And here is the part that should make everyone pay attention. History does not wait for clarity. It does not pause while leaders debate. It moves forward based on decisions made in moments exactly like this, moments of uncertainty, moments of tension, moments where the old rules no longer feel as solid as they once did. Because the truth is, the world is not waiting to see what happens next. It is already adapting. Every new agreement, every military exercise, every strategic conversation is a step toward a future that looks different from the past. A future where no single country holds all the trust. A future where alliances are more flexible but also more fragile. A future where every nation has to think not just about who stands with them, but what happens if no one does. And that is the real story. Not just what was said, not just who reacted, but what has already changed. Because once trust begins to fracture at this level, it does not fully return. It evolves into something else, something more cautious, something more calculated, something more uncertain. And the question now is not whether the system will change. It already has. The question is how far it will go and whether the next move brings stability or something far more dangerous. This is not just politics. This is not just headlines. This is the future of global security being rewritten in real time. The only question left is who adapts fast enough to survive it.